Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Bernoulli. Today we have Alasdair Macleod and Jayant Bhandari. Alasdair is head of research for Gold Money and an Austrian economist. He has a background as a stockbroker, banker, and fund manager. Jayant is constantly traveling the world looking for investment opportunities, particularly in the natural resources sector. He advises institutional investors about his findings. He worked prior 6 years with U.S. Global Investors in Texas, a boutique natural resource investment firm, and also for 1 year with Casey Research. He also is a follower of the Austrian School of Economics. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Great. Today I thought we'd do a discussion on currencies, commodities, cryptocurrencies, what's happening there, an update from India, and also just what monetary policies are doing by the major central banks. Some recent writings by Alasdair in that regard. So to kick things off, just wondering, Jayant, if you want to give an update. We were just talking about the recent announcement by the Reserve Bank of India.
Richard, a very funny thing came out a few days back by the Reserve Bank of India. Firstly, the reality is that in this electronic age, when you have deposited all the money into the banking system, the government should have released the effect of the demonetization very soon after the end of December 2016. And I'm talking about the demonetization process that started in November 2016. Now, a few days back, they came out with a news saying that 99% of the demonetized currency had been deposited with the bank by the end of March 2017, which basically means that more than 100% of the money in circulation was actually deposited, which basically, if you try to understand what this means is that not only legal tender was deposited, the counterfeit currency in circulation also ended up getting deposited with the banking system. So not only the banking system of India completely failed to stop corruption or black money, they actually converted counterfeit currency into legal currency. Now also, if you read the recent news releases, they have also come out with the latest survey reports, which now tell you that the economic growth has fallen to 5.7%, which is now much lower than that of China. And it clearly shows that Indian economy is now starting to stagnate. In my view, it was stagnating 6 months back, and it's actually regressing in my view. Two more things before I go complete my response here, Richard. Most of the growth can be attributed to destruction of the informal economy and transfer of that economy to the formal economy, which in real terms means that they are destroying the economy, not improving the economy. Also, a huge amount of GDP increase is a result of massive increase in government spending, which is, of course, as you and I know, is not sustainable, and it's actually not helpful to the economy or the society. So there are constantly negative news coming out of India right now.
Your thoughts, Alasdair?
Well, I find that fascinating. It doesn't surprise me. Before we came on, we were just sort of remembering last time we spoke about ties, and I think you, Richard, agreed that this was going to be economically destructive. Yet, from what the Reserve Bank of the Reserve Bank of India money has been sorted, which means that there's got to be some money which isn't money in there. And the economic growth figures have been fiddled with. There is no way that you can destroy them and then expect growth of any sort to occur, because economic growth or contraction is purely a reflection of the money. Economic growth simply collapses. And it seems to me that what's happened is that the figures have been fiddled one way and another, as Jayant suggests, to come up with something that looks reasonable in the circumstances. I wouldn't believe for a moment that there's been economic growth of 5.7%. I don't actually hold any candle for the concept of economic growth. What I hold a candle is completely meaningless, because you can't get at what is going on in the economy, whether it's progressing or not. I would say that that figure is just completely false and anyway pretty meaningless.
Jayant, what has been the effect on the currency, the exchange rate, and purchasing power, and inflation, deflation?
So food prices in the country have now started to rise. So if you remember, Richard, when we talked initially soon after demonetization, I was telling you that food prices had fallen drastically. Food prices were down about 50% or so, which seems like good information to most people. But the reality is that food prices fell down so much because poor people were unable to feed themselves. Hundreds of millions of people had lost their jobs, and they had no option but to reduce their food consumption. Now, that also meant that farmers could not really make money, and they did not sow properly for the next season, which now means that food prices are now increasing across the country. So that is the harm that has been done to the inflation deflation situation. Deflation happened for the wrong reason, and now inflation is happening for the wrong reason in the country.
And what has been the effect on gold prices in rupee terms locally?
So Indian currency has surprisingly done very well in the last several months. Now, these are all in the short term. I don't think anyone should pay attention to the currency prices, because these changes tend to be noise. And there is another thing that is happening, that Western institutional investors continue to be very euphoric about India. The reason why they keep pumping money into the Indian stock market, and as a result of that, more of Western money keeps flowing into country to India, which has helped the Indian currency. Now, another thing that is happening is the situation with gold and Bitcoin. Bitcoin is being bought by Indians these days. A lot of people now come to me asking me about Bitcoin, and a lot of people have increased their consumption of gold. They have also increased the storage of gold in Hong Kong, Dubai, and Singapore. This is what rich Indians are doing. So in my view, from what I see, gold consumption has gone up, Bitcoin consumption has gone up in that country as well.
And you were mentioning earlier about also the rise of other metal prices, like the base metals, over the last year period. Can you provide some commentary on that, Jayant?
Well, this is, of course, a good sign, in my view, that China continues to consume a huge amount of commodities, which, in my view, underpins the future of China, which is that China continues to grow. And I continue to be very optimistic about China and hence of commodities. And I continue to be optimistic about gold, but for the wrong reason, which is that many of the third world countries continue to stagnate and suffer as a consequence of bad policies.
Alasdair, your thoughts on the rise of base metals and how that relates to the precious metals?
I think Jayant is absolutely right about China. China if you like, is a mercantilist economy. It is driven, if you like, by policy from the centre. And the policy from the centre on various 5-year plans, and we're on the 13th 5-year plan now, is basically to create an industrial revolution throughout Asia. And at the same time, the Spice Route, the Spice Road project, the OBOR project, is beginning to cut down substantially the transcontinental shipment times. There's an enormous number of trains now going between China and Europe, and we're now in a position where Mercedes, for example, in Stuttgart, can put a car, a brand new car on the train, ship it over to China on that train, and have it in a showroom in Beijing in 15 days. That time is going to come down to around about 10 or 12 days eventually, and probably in the not too distant future. And this compares with sea transport times of at least 30 days for the same thing. At the same time, you have companies in Europe like Zanussi, white goods, Italian white goods manufacturer. They've got factories in China, and they're shipping their white goods by rail now in containerized shipments. Again, they're getting the benefit of their goods coming into Europe within literally almost a fortnight out of the factory. Now, this is very, very beneficial, and China is in effect driving the economy of the whole of the Eurasian continent. It's becoming particularly visible in the Asian part. It is becoming more visible in the European part. The German economy is going like a train. It really is. Other Eurozone economies are, if you like, then they don't have the manufacturing prowess, but nonetheless they are beginning to recover. And this is really the story, I think, for the next 2 or 3 years at least, as far as Europe is concerned. So when it comes back to base metals, the demand for base metals, I don't think we've seen anything yet. And there is another aspect in this, and that is the currency aspect. What China basically wants to do is to do away with using the dollar as a settlement currency for her trade. And she's made enormous strides to achieve this end. And there will come a point where she will take a view on her reserves, which total around about $3 trillion equivalent. Most of it is in dollars, and about $1 trillion of it is invested in T-bills and bonds and treasury bonds and so on. They'll come to a view about that relative to currencies, and I think we're on the edge of China reducing her reserves in favor of buying base metals, because she needs copper in particular. She's redoing the whole of her electric network, her grid. Air conditioning is a huge market in China. And the building of these cities, I mean, we think these are just castles in the sky, but they're not. Actually, what China is doing by building these cities is she is seeking to rehouse huge numbers of people, up to 200 million people is the plan, where they get redeployed from low-value agricultural and that sort of subsistence existence into these satellite cities, where they will be redeployed in manufacturing, in all the sort of activities, if you like, that go with a modern economy. The Chinese economy it is becoming rather like a European economy. If you take a 5-year view on it, it's going to become service-driven. You've got middle classes and all the rest of it. And middle classes want things like air conditioning. They want electricity that works. And so this is the demand for copper that we're seeing. And when it comes to all the construction, the railroads, the improvements that are going on, the industrialization of the whole of Asia, that's where things like iron and steel come in. And of course, you've got all the other metals. Gold's relation to this, well, there are two ways of looking at it, I think. And the first is that the price of base metals, the price of anything, energy as well, is a lot more stable over the centuries measured in gold than it is in paper currency. And I think that's a very, very important point to bear in mind. So if you see the base metal complex rising in price, then it is likely that that will put an upward stimulus on the price of gold as well, measured in paper currencies. And the reason for that is that it's paper currencies that are losing their purchasing power, not gold. So that's the first point. The second point I would make about gold is that if China is serious about doing away with the dollar, the yuan as currently constituted is not a satisfactory substitute for the dollar. So what she must do is offer trade partners, if you like, the ability to settle in something else. And this is where gold comes in. And we're seeing this on the futures exchanges in Shanghai. There's a yuan contract already on the futures market for gold. The next contract that's coming in, and it'll come in by the end of this year, is a yuan contract in oil. So what this means is that a country like Iran, who exports a lot of oil to China, because Iran doesn't want to use the dollar, and she is restricted very heavily in what she can do with dollars. She doesn't want to have anything to do with the dollar. She doesn't necessarily want to take yuan. So what she will do is, through the futures exchanges, she will cover her shipments, the payments that she expects from her shipments to China through the futures market. First of all, converting oil into yuan, and then another futures contract converting yuan into gold. And this is going to produce, I think, a demand for gold, which will not be satisfied by China, incidentally. It will be satisfied through the market, through deliveries through the market, which is going to put quite a drain on global gold resources. So this is another way in which China is going to move away from settlements in the dollar, and that is to provide the facilities, if you like, as an interim stage for her trade partners to accept payment, in effect, in gold by bridging through the futures. Eventually, what she has got to do is she has got to formalize the relationship between the yuan and gold. And that, I think, will happen in time. How long is difficult to say. All I can say is that the moment that is done, and almost actually the moment that Iran can go and just literally sell oil to China in return for gold by using the mechanism of the futures markets, then this is almost like a financial nuclear attack on the dollar. And I do see the dollar is very, very vulnerable to this. The timing on this, I think, in a sense, has been speeded up by the election of Donald Trump, because that's produced a huge air of uncertainty in international trade relations. America is isolating herself in this, but I think that the Chinese, they will move cautiously. But watch North Korea, watch Afghanistan. That's another thing. I think that also watch the relationship between China and Russia, which is very, very close. And I think the Russians might have some input as to the timing on when they, if you like, pull the rug out from underneath the dollar. So this is, I think we're living on a sort of cliff edge, if you like, as far as the dollar is concerned, and this is a fascinating time. And I think anyone who basically, doesn't hold any gold or silver, for that matter, which is a geared play on gold in financial terms, I think could find themselves with egg on their faces. So it's a very, very interesting time. And I would be very positive, I think, on what's going on base metals and also on gold. And it's all to do with China. China is developing the most amazing economy for the whole of Asia. I think Europe is a major beneficiary. Europe will overheat very quickly on this, by the way. So there's got to be a very sharp reversal in monetary policy by the ECB. But guess who's left out of who's not in the game at all? And that's America. America has just isolated herself from the gold game, and she's sitting there wondering what to do about it.
Jayant, you spend a lot of time in Asia. Do you see the same type of dynamics from your perspective as Alasdair has elaborated on?
I'm certainly extremely bullish on China. I go to China quite often, and I have talked with you about this several times, Richard. I continue to see good growth taking place in China. And I see whenever I go to villages, towns, and cities in China, I see improvement. Sidewalks get constructed, coffee shops come up, the coffee shops get cleaner and more hygienic as time passes by. So China is actually improving consistently as time has gone by. One thing very interesting to add to what Alasdair was talking about is to look at the currency chart, the comparison of yuan with US dollar. Now, 2 years back, people were starting to feel very pessimistic about the Chinese currency. They were thinking China was going to start regressing or stop growing. And Chinese currency actually did continue to fall for about 1.5 years. But then people don't really talk much about the Chinese currency, because since the beginning of this year, Chinese currency has improved massively and has gained back at least half of the losses it has made in the earlier 1.5 years. So this is also a reflection of the fact that Chinese economy is actually doing quite well.
Alasdair, you've recently written about the Jackson Hole speeches of Yellen and Draghi, omitting commentary about the burning issues of the day, and you list a few of those. One is a question: why is the ECB injecting $60 billion per month if the great financial crisis is over? In the same writing, you also indicate, in reference to the Fed, normalizing interest rates. It will take nominal rates only 1% to 2% to set off another financial crisis. So how do you see things playing out? Do you see what you just mentioned earlier as putting more pressure on the ECB and the Fed?
Yes, I do. I think the importance about the China story is that everybody who's got commodities to export, everybody who has territory, if you like, on the Eurasian continent is going to benefit from what China is doing. America is not. America doesn't have any friends, really, in the trade sense. She's even turning around under NAFTA and telling Canada and Mexico, we don't like this arrangement, we're going to rejig it. They've already given up on any sort of transatlantic and trans-Pacific idea. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. America has isolated herself. But where this translates into economic performance is that I view the US economy as still being in the recovery stage from the great financial crisis. By that, I mean in the credit cycle. The next phase of the credit cycle is the one of expansion. The expansion of credit, when banks actually start competing to lend to the 80% of the economy, which is the medium size and smaller businesses. We're not there yet, I think, in America. And we probably never will get there because of the trade policies and the isolationism of President Trump. But Europe is a very different thing. Europe is turning around very, very quickly. And I noticed in the Jackson Hole speech that Mario Draghi made, he made reference to the time difference in terms of recovery between the Eurozone and America. And he got it completely wrong. He said, you're ahead of us in the recovery. No, Europe is actually now ahead of America. Europe is now expanding very rapidly. We've yet to see it really, I suppose, in all the statistics. But the anecdotal evidence, and if you just watch what's going on and you just look at the situation, I mean, I described the situation for a company like Zanussi in Italy. Italy is a basket case, for goodness sake. Yet there is a major Italian company who's doing incredible, the motor manufacturers, particularly the German manufacturers. I mean, this is amazing. And the interest in Europe is actually going to go one further. Very soon, I think you'll find that Germany, for the Eurozone, and what that means is there will be a break with the American-led NATO arrangement, whereby America says, this is who we're going to have sanctions gain, and everybody's going to fall in with it. I think that's going to stop, and this is terribly important because it's in which Mario Draghi and the ECB doesn't seem to recognize here we are. We've got banks who deposit money at the ECB have a negative interest rate of 0.4%. The interest rate from the ECB is 0%. So you've got somewhere between negative interest rates and zero rates. They are doing quantitative easing of 60 billion euros a month. And they're still doing this. And in my judgment, in the credit cycle, they have moved from recovery and they're moving into expansion. Monetary policy in the ECB is completely inappropriate for what's going on. So I see the big shock, if you like, by the end of this year has got to be a complete volte-face by the ECB when it comes to monetary policy. We're already getting wind of this. The euro has risen from, 105 against the dollar. It's now currently knocking on 120 to the dollar. And of course, you've got all the manufacturers in Europe turning around and saying, oh, the currency's too expensive. How dare you raise interest rates to make the situation worse? So the ECB's got itself into this hole, which so often central banks who are behind the curve find themselves. And this is going to be very, very difficult for them. They're going to be forced, first of all, stop QE rates very, very rapidly on top of quite a significant rise. Problem also, and that is that with the dollar declining, eventually she is going to have to think quite seriously about raising interest rates to a huge rate debt problem in the economy, which really means that over-indebted businesses are going to find that the cost of money starts going against them, and they're going to start failing. So it's an interesting one. If you go back to the Eurozone, you've also got the problem, and the banks are all up to their necks at the moment in government debt, and that government debt is wildly overvalued. It's overvalued on the basis that the ECB is in there buying relatively scarce bonds, pushing down yields. The moment that stops, there are going to be huge, great losses on the Italian banks over and above all the losses that they haven't dealt with from the financial crisis. So I can see the worst nightmare, I think, for a central banker is that we move from this sort of recovery phase, which just rumbles on and rumbles on and rumbles on. They don't have to raise interest rates. They ignore things like, unemployment, and inflation sort of stays somewhere around about 2%. And everybody's happy with that. If you actually get an expansion of credit because things are going like a train or beginning to go like a train, because I think must hope that we're in a permanent state of repressed recovery. But I don't think that's going to be the case, unfortunately, with the Eurozone because of the Chinese stimulus across the whole of the Asian continent.
And so from this, what is your outlook on the euro, the US dollar, and gold prices?
Dollar down, gold prices up, euro up. I think there's going to come a point where the euro, I don't know whether the euro outpaces gold or not. At the moment, gold is outpacing the euro. I mean, if you look at gold measured in euros, it's only up about something like 3%, something like that this year. It was actually down 2% until fairly recently. But basically, to answer your question, I think that gold is going to go up. This one thing that will really, really light a fire under gold, I think, is that when the Chinese come in with the oil to yuan contract on the futures market, and then you're going to get Russia, you're going to get Iran, you're going to get various other oil-producing Asian countries using that facility to not buy dollars, but to just sell their oil for gold. And I think that's going to make a huge difference.
And Jayant, your views on ECB policy and Fed policy, and your outlook for the currencies and gold?
Well, gold price. I'm very optimistic about the gold price, and virtually every sign tells me that gold is going to go up, not only the monetary policies, but also what I see as stagnation happening, economic stagnation in the third world countries, except for China, of course. Also, the North Korean situation is very likely going to continue to push the gold price up. I might add some comment on Canada. Canada has recently increased the interest rate. And as we know, the housing prices have been going up continuously in Vancouver, Toronto. And the Canadian society is hugely indebted. The private debts are huge. So it will be amusing to see what happens if Canada continues to keep the interest rate at what they have now declared, or actually increase it going forward.
Interesting. Great insights, gentlemen. Just wondering how our listeners can learn more about your work. Alasdair?
Well, I publish an article every Thursday around about midday, I guess, in Eastern Standard Time. You can access it via the website, or the other way to access it is open an account and we'll send you an email. But basically, I publish an article once a week on the Thursdays. I also do a market report on the Fridays. And what I try and do is look as dispassionately as possible at both what's going on, if you like, in the futures markets, physical markets, if I have good information. And I don't rely on charts at all on that. I mean, what I will do is I will quote charts because other people use charts, but I try and get to the nitty gritty as to what the balances are and, where the interest is in the market. And that's quite fun. That's on a Friday. I write that on a Friday before we get the commitment of traders figures. So it's a slight leap in the dark, but anyway, those are the two things that my regular contributions, if you like.
Great. And Jayant?
Everything I do, Richard, is on my website, jayantbhandari.com.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll do another session again. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Richard.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.